Hello, my name is Alexander Solozhin. I am an RA here at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. For our War Observatory project, we're conducting a series of interviews with experts in various academic fields relevant to the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine. In this series, we cover basic and advanced subject matters relevant to the war. We intend for these videos to be used as teaching materials for faculty and students in Canada and around the world. Joining me here today to answer a few questions regarding the European Union's role in the war in Ukraine is Dr. Joan DeBardeleben. Dr. DeBardeleben is Chancellor's Professor here at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. Her academic interests include the European Union and Russia, the EU's European Neighborhood Policy and Eastern Partnership, politics and society in the Soviet successor states, especially Russia, federalism and multi-level governance in Europe and Russia, Russian elections, and Russian federalism. Her current research projects include the EU and Ukraine crisis, causes and consequence, and Russian federalism and elections in Russia. We'll begin with some basic questions. So the first question is, what is the relationship like between the EU and Ukraine? What was it like before the war, and what is it like today?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, after Ukraine gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, pretty soon thereafter, the EU and Ukraine concluded a partnership and cooperation agreement, which put them on a course of diplomatic interaction, with the EU trying to promote reform and good governance in Ukraine. Now, following that, this proceeded through various stages, but I think another key date was in 2004, and that was the year when these other countries in Central and Eastern Europe joined the EU. There were several countries that joined that were neighbors of Ukraine, but Ukraine at that time was not really on the list of countries that were eligible to join the EU. So the EU issued a policy called the European Neighborhood Policy, which was directed toward the countries that were on the perimeter of the EU, both in the south and in the east. And it was updated in 2009 to be called something the Eastern Partnership Policy. And under the Eastern Partnership Policy, of which Ukraine was a part, the EU really tried to take a much more assertive effort to promoting democratic reform, market reform, and to encouraging the countries who were post-Soviet countries but were not really on a track to join the EU to follow a sort of European path. And this really has set the trajectory in recent years since 2009 for the EU-Ukraine relationship. It was all kind of directed toward Ukraine concluding what's called an association agreement with the EU, as well as a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. And so these are the things that were expected to be signed actually in 2013 at a summit that Ukraine was participating in with the EU. But this is where the problems really began when the Ukrainian leadership stepped back from signing those agreements that had quite a lot of popular support in Ukraine. And this is what triggered the Russian reaction and eventually the conflict with Russia over Crimea, when Russia eventually ended up annexing Crimea. So since 2014, after that, there was a transition in Ukraine where Ukraine elected a new leader who was pro-European, and the association agreement and the free trade agreements were actually signed between Ukraine and the European Union. And since then, Ukraine has been on the track of trying to realize the provisions of those agreements. So at the point where the 2022 war started, Ukraine seemed to be on a trajectory of realizing the ambition of this, implementing the conditions of this association agreement and the free trade agreement. Now, these agreements did not really provide a prospect for EU membership, however, and we can talk about that a little bit later. And so after the war began, there were further developments, but I'll stop there for now and we can kind of pick up on that theme.
And the next question what importance does the war have for European Union?
Well, I mean, apart from interrupting that process I just described of developing Ukraine-EU relations, because in a war, of course, it's very hard to pursue political and economic reform. I mean, it's a question of survival for Ukraine right now. But I mean, I think there are really two important areas of deep significance for the European Union in relation to this war. The first is, if you think back to the origins of the European integration project after World War II, it was really a lot about establishing peace and prosperity in Europe. In other words, avoiding another war in Europe was one of the major goals of the whole European integration process. And a fundamental idea of that was that through economic interdependence, countries would be less likely to go to war with each other. And of course, the Ukraine war has put that all in doubt. It's put it in doubt first because we have a war in Europe now. And so, you know, the very idea of what the European Union was trying to achieve has been undermined. But importantly, in terms of the relationship with Russia, the idea that you could, you know, develop a very good constructive relationship with Russia through economic interdependence, primarily energy interdependence, has also now faltered. And so the EU has to really begin to rethink, you know, what can be done to assure peace and prosperity in Europe. The second point is that Russia's aggression against Ukraine really puts under challenge many of the normative principles that the EU has strongly supported, principles of international law, principles of the inviolability of international borders. And so it challenges the whole kind of normative base, the whole values base that the EU has been promoting in its foreign policy agenda.